But first of all, I wanted to thank Joe to make this all happen, and also everyone who's part of the whole project. I'm into money studies since 30 years now, but as we all know, there's no such thing as money studies. Although we also know that money is the most important social technique in the history of mankind, together with language, writing, science, and in Europe, soccer, and in the US, football or hockey, as we learned. Canada. I don't know a similar project to this one, and I think it's going to take something like a concerned effort to tackle the notorious money riddle. And as to understand money means nothing less than to understand the equally unconscious and practically effective form of our own socialization, or rather it is a problem to understand money that corresponds to the problem to understand our very own socialization. I think that the best theory of money is still offered by Marx's critique of the political economy, although I will emphasize that it is rather a critique of money than a theory. Critique, however, in the classical sense that the term received from Kant and Hegel, so not in the sense of a negative judgment. That also already makes clear that my Marx appropriation comes from philosophy, because in my opinion, philosophy allows the most radical appropriation and access. Okay, so much in advance, the rest must do my talk now. The title of my talk is The Materialist God, Marx's Critique of Money. The talk has three parts. The first introduces Marx's concept of critique, or rather, how Marx struggled to find an adequate mode of criticizing capitalist society. The second part reconstructs in Marx's work the central concepts and strands that culminate in the concept of capitalist money. And the third part shows the philosophical implications and consequences of this concept. So I start with the first part, which introduces Marx's concept of critique. This part is entitled The Materialist Turn of Philosophy. Marx's writings are, like all classical texts, open to different readings and applications. There have been philosophical, sociological, and economic interpretations, but above all, in the course of the 1960s, a real multiplication began with a series of new readings of Marx, such as operaist and then post-operaist readings, structuralist and then post-structuralist readings, form analytic, feminist, post-colonial, and particularly topical today, queer feminist and ecological readings. A common denominator throughout was to read Marx's writings as a critique. However, there is an ambivalence regarding this common denominator persisting throughout Marx's entire work. What does critique actually mean? The starting point of both Marx's critique and its ambivalence can be found in his aim of contesting philosophy, but soon, together with Engels, I quote, to settle accounts with the former philosophical conscience by a critique of post-Hegelian philosophy. He wrote that in the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, so in a kind of first version of Capital. This first version also presents how Marx precisely wanted to settle accounts with philosophy and Hegel. He claims a kind of materialist turn of philosophy through the critique of political economy. It is this turn that brought an ambivalent status to his critique and is contested up until today without any final conclusion or resolution. The materialist turn is usually understood to have been taken up from the writings Marx refers to in the preface I quoted, namely from the collection of writings known as the German ideology. These texts have been reasoned as a foundation of what in the Marxist tradition later became canonical as historical materialism. Here, Marx took up the criticism of religion, and according to Marx, the premise of all criticism is a criticism of religion. He took this critique of religion from Feuerbach, but he now wants to challenge with this critique capitalist society from its highest point, so to say, namely from the height of its philosophical self-understanding as it was conceptualized by German idealism from Kant to Hegel. So what does it mean, contest society from its highest point of self-understanding? It means that instead of a religious God, the critique now had to regard its illumination in the new reasonable God of the philosophers, the spirit or Geist, as especially Hegel termed it. So it is now the spirit in which the critique of religion shall become the self-understanding of reason, and consequently, it is this spirit that Marx wants to give a materialist turn. The most pregnant and most known formulation of this turn is presented in his well-known thesis on Feuerbach from 1845, whose famous 11th thesis announces that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And the last, most definite formulation of the turn is given by Marx in 1873 in the foreword of Capital Volume 1, where he defines the difference between Hegel's dialectic and his own. Marx claims here to reveal the rational kernel of Hegel's dialectic, and he gives the materialist turn a telling picture that became well known, namely to invert what in Hegel is standing on its head. So the point is to put the spirit from head to the feet. However, the ambivalence I mentioned regards not this materialist term as such. It is undisputed that Marx with this term claims three things. First, the term shall socialize philosophy in general and dialectics and spirit specifically by showing their conditions in the social forms of capitalist society. This is in order to, secondly, show why these social forms appear and disappear in these concepts, and they are presented by philosophy as philosophy, and require other concepts and categories for themselves, concepts adequate to capitalist society. And both things shall thirdly and finally point to practical consequences. Marx is the last philosopher insofar as he turns philosophy at its highest point into a radical critique, a critique that shall overcome society practically, as the 11th Feuerbach thesis shall indicate. Okay, but if this goal of the materialist turn is undisputed, what then is the ambivalence? The ambivalence does not lie in Marx's materialist turn as such. It is rather that his writings presents not one, but two materialist turns, and with them two social subjects. The two turns and their subjects are struggling in a hidden conflict throughout Marx's work, but also in the history of the critique after Marx. So what are these two turns? The already presented first turn is more exoteric, as it were, and it was predominant in the official history of classical Marxism, i.e. in the socialist labor movement and its parties, organizations, and struggles. This turn aims to reveal the social subject per se, the productive power of the capitalist mode of production, the agent of social conflicts, and the progressive force in historical dynamics. This social subject is, of course, the working class or the proletariat. This exoteric materialist turn also highlights the existential expropriation and alienation, exploitation and objectivation of the working class by capitalist production relations. It hence reveals why in capitalism this contradiction of labor and capital, as a classical formula in Marxist tradition says it, is reasoned and justified, but also hidden and inverted in philosophy, and not only in philosophy, but also in bourgeois ideas and ideals, in everyday consciousness, and also in the form of law, the state, and in politics, which all posit capitalist bourgeois society as a trans-historical truth with a quasi-natural status. To reveal this ultimately shall question the supposed end of history and demonstrate why a practical turn is necessary, a revolutionary overcoming of capitalist society. I think most of us are familiar with this kind of materialist turn Marx brought into critique. The second materialist turn is rather esoteric, so to say. This materialist turn is connected with a kind of turn within Marx's own work. The term is controversially debated, and the debate is mainly oriented on what the French Marxist Louis Althusser, referring to Gaston Bachelard, called an epistemological break. And it is this break that shall help us to reveal Marx's second turn. This turn happened between the young Marx, before the German ideology, and the scientific major Marx, who shifted in the 1850s to a critique of political economy. According to Althusser, with this shift to the whole project of the critique of political economy, Marx set up a whole new problematic. While according to Althusser, the young Marx formulated his critique before the break in his coming to terms with philosophy, using a Hegelian dialectical concept of alienation in a humanist anthropological essence, the economic writings mark a departure that, at once, marks a breakthrough for the scientific presentation of social relations. So with the break, Althusser emphasizes a scientific breakthrough. However, he also assigns this science a new status different from the classical understanding. According to Althusser, the object in Marx's economic texts is rather problematic. He has not formulated a positive science as claimed by classical Marxism. He only presents an economic difficulty. I only refer you to the break in Marx and to the problematic readable in Marx, because both is striking to understand the second materialist turn, the esoteric one. In the course of his critique of political economy, Marx starts an esoteric turn by introducing a hidden social subject, a subject that is mediating the former social subject, the working class, but also its labor, its means, and the whole production process. This hidden subject rules by the form of social mediation, namely by the commodity form and the value form. Here we discover money as a social subject, or more precisely, capitalist money, as this capitalist money is different from all monetary forms before capitalism. The second materialist turn presents money as a quasi-subject. Money in capitalism becomes a super-individual, overarching subject like the spirit in Hegel. But money is a subject also on the level of the individual subjectivity, because the economic categories in Marx, again like in Hegel, are always both at the same time. They are objective as well as subjective. I quote, "Categories express forms of being, determinations of existence," in German Daseinsformen, Existenzbestimmung. So money is entangled with our modern rational subjectivity, our forms of thinking, and our mode of existing. But there's more than that. The second materialist turn also reveals that there is a kind of turn in power, unconscious as much as practical, through this subject of capitalist mediation itself. A turn insofar as money literally turns social relations into quantitative relations, becoming the form of their valorization and establishing its own capitalist self-reference in this form. That Marx shows this practical turn of social relations into quantitative relations is also why this second materialist turn is methodologically more radical. It does not base its critique in figures of alienation and class division, but on radical distinctions at the level of fundamental economic categories, first and foremost in the famous dual character of labor and the commodity, but ultimately in the dual character of the whole production process, which in capitalism is on the one hand a material labor and reproduction process, and on the other, a valorization and accumulation of pure quantitative values. And the social subject making these distinctions in and for the economy, and at once mediating and mastering them, coming to constitute social objectivity, this social subject is money. Okay, so to summarize these two terms, we have in Marx on the one hand a materialism of social practice, social contradiction, and class struggle. And we have on the other a materialism of the immaterial but practical effective social form. In the first materialism, the working class is the actual and at the same time self-alienated and exploited subject of society and history. In the second materialism, money becomes the overarching subject by quantitatively actualizing social relations and formalizing the objectivity of society. Therefore, in the Marxist tradition, we have two different modes of critique. Two different modes of critique have emerged. The first is classical Marxism, who based its struggles, its party politics, and even a socialist state on class, the contradiction of labor and capital, and an objective labor theory of value, addressing a revolutionary subject. The second strand is Western Marxism, critical theory, and heterodox strands of Marxism, up until today so-called post-Marxism, which addressed in their critique the form of capitalist mediation and valorization as a form of social totality. Okay, so much for the two materialist terms. In the following, I will reconstruct these two terms in Marx's writings itself, starting from his first writings and ending with capital. Apart from this twofold term, we can differentiate in Marx three phases that covers three stages of critique. There's firstly the young philosophical Marx of the early writings, who as a young Hegelian struggles with philosophy. That was a time in the 1840s. Then there's the middle Marx, the Marx of the phase of the political emphasis during the revolutionary uprisings of 1848. And finally, there's the old mature Marx after that emphasis, who more than 2 decades long elaborated on his critique of political economy in his exile in London and wrote his Capital. So I come to my second part of my talk, to money in Marx's work, and I start with Marx's first phase, with money in the early writings. Marx's first important work was his dissertation, The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature, written in 1840, 1841. In this dissertation, money appears only in one illustrative comparison in the appendix, but tellingly, in an analogy to belief, religion, and God. But although money plays no particularly strong role yet, there's something other very important for his later concept of money. Here, Marx firstly elaborated and explicated his idea of materialism, and it is this materialism that also forged a path to his concept of capitalist money. It is a new version of materialism based with Hegel on motion and dialectics, but the aim was to detach motion and dialectics from their metaphysical character by situating these concepts in the very same social and historical conditions that emerge through them. This kind of self-reflexivity and self-organization of matter will eventually be taken up in the 1970s by post-structuralist reading of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and later, or actually today, by new materialism and so-called speculative realism. In On the Jewish Question, written in 1843, Marx sets God and money in an analogous self-alienation of man from his species being, Gattungswesen. Emancipation, therefore, is the recovery of this species being. However, the whole concept of alienation and emancipation is still quite a simple inversion. A much more precise concept of alienation is presented in the economic and philosophic manuscripts from 1844, also called the Paris manuscripts, a series of notes Marx made for his own self-understanding, published only posthumously. In these manuscripts, he situates and at once bases his materialism in human practice under the social conditions of capitalism and its historical context. However, this basis still is a species being which is not yet specifically determined by capitalist social relations. Thus, it is open to rather anthropological and even ontological interpretations. Following World War II, these Paris manuscripts became very influential for the humanist reading of Marx and the philosophy of praxis. The next enormously influential writings are the bundle of manuscripts later called the German Ideology. I already mentioned them earlier. They have been written, some of them now together with Engels, between 1845 and 47, and they have not been published at this time except for a fragment. We can add to this writing the equally important and published Communist Manifesto from 1848. In all these writings, Marx orients his critique towards social and historical praxis. This human praxis became a concept of totality, but by locating praxis as historically and socially specific, avoiding now an anthropological or metaphysical status. To quote a relevant passage, all social life is essentially practical. All mysterious which lead theories to mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this praxis. End of quote. This led to interpreting these writings as a foundation of the notorious historical materialism, although, and this is important, Marx himself never used this term. It was only the late Engels who coined it, and later Soviet Marxism. Nevertheless, the historical and materialist agent and the progressive power in these writings, undeniable, is the working class and its labor and praxis. However, it is important to point out that as early as 1842, Marx already discovered the concept of fetishism. He took it from the French writer and encyclopedist Charles de Brosse, who employed it for Western African culture. At first, Marx only showed that it is also European and capitalist society in which fetishistic thinking takes place. Like in the case of money and God, this fetishistic thinking already means more than pure analogy, but Marx is not yet really identifying fetishism as an internal relation with capitalist social relations. 25 years later, however, in the famous chapter of the fetish character of the commodity in Capital Volume 1, fetishism becomes nothing less than the groundbreaking concept for the connection between the economic constitution of objects and the subjective mode of their cognition. Now, in Capital, fetishism is virtually elevated to the rank of a materialist critique of epistemology, and money is the universal fetish. It is a universal fetish, but not because it is worshipped like an idol or a deity, nor because it stands for wealth in its abstract, pure, and dazzling form. Rather, due to its functioning in the capitalist mode of production, money actually realizes and represents the productive power of capitalist valorization of labor and capital. It realizes their valorization through, and this is where the fetishistic is to be sought, through pure quantitative values. This kind of fetishism demands a unity of critique of economy and of knowledge, and money is the interface, as it were, for such a unity. Okay, with this anticipation of fetishism, I want to conclude the first phase of Marx, who wanted to come to terms with philosophy. We come to the second phase of the middle Marx. This middle Marx, between 1845 and his first years in London after his 1849 exile, is the Marx of the passage between the critique of philosophy and the critique of political economy. In this period, Marx underwent a phase of political emphasis and crisis. In 1848, Marx wrote with Engels the Manifesto of the Communist Party, in 1815, the class struggle in France, and in 1852, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. All these writings are dealing with political struggle and praxis, with class, with historical progress and its nonlinearity, and socialism. Most important with regard to a critique of money was his critique of Proudhon in the poverty of philosophy. His critique of Proudhon was directed against inadequate and limited conceptions of basic economic categories such as use value, exchange value, labor, and also money. This text is crucial as Marx, through this critique, clarified his own methodological understanding for his own development of these categories. As I said, this phase of the middle political Marx has been a kind of transition. Marx was engaged in the political struggles and upheavals of the 1848, but when the revolution failed, social and historical dynamics and society's self-mystification became again more important, and their understanding now called not for philosophy, but for the study and the elaboration of the capitalist economy. It was this orientation to political economy that brought an important shift towards a more esoteric materialist term as materialism, motion, and human and social practice were to be understood as a social mediation that takes place behind the back of the actors and is as social as it is primordial. So instead of criticizing that in philosophy capitalism appears perverted, Marx now demonstrates that capitalist mediation is a kind of real metaphysics, and to develop this reality of metaphysics means first of all to develop the systematic of the capitalist economy and its categories. Money, its validity and functions, its circles and effects became crucial. The same goes for fetishism, which has an epistemological status of its own, and both money and fetishism are now no longer brought to an analogy to religion and God, nor to spirit as the God of the philosophy. The analogy now concerns rather the constitution of objectivity by modern natural science, which objectifies natural relations through their quantification. And it seems that in capitalism, not only natural, but also social relations by quantification become objectified, creating a second pure social nature analogous to the first nature. This critique of a second nature became very influential in Western Marxism and critical theory, especially in Theodor Adorno and Alfred Riedel. So I hope with this change in the mode or the status of critique, also the second esoteric materialist term becomes clearer now. To put it provocatively, it is not from the standpoint of the working class that Marx develops how society mediates itself, but rather from the standpoint of money. With this, we finally reach the third and last phase of Marx's writings, the economic writings around capital and, of course, capital itself. In the economic writings before Capital, especially in the unfinished manuscript that became called the Grundrisse, and in a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx's concept of money still differed from that in Capital. Therefore, certain ambivalences resulted in the concept of money. While in some passages of the Grundrisse, Marx suggests a sign, symbol, and medium theory of money, in Capital he seems to suggest a commodity theory of money. However, in my view, the critical content of his concept of money can be revealed only if it's placed beyond any nominalist sign and medium theory and beyond any metalist or substantialist theory of money, including a commodity theory of money. Marx rather develops a capital theory of money. A similar important ambivalence occurred in his concept of value. Even though Marx's theory of value has often been interpreted as a labor theory of value, also his concept of value, in my view, is situated beyond such an objective labor theory, but also beyond all subjective marginalist theories of value in neoclassicism. He establishes value as a category sui generis, and as for money, he also for value develops a capital theory. So much for the economical writings before Capital. Let's look now finally to his famous main work. Marx's Capital is neither a theory nor a philosophy, but a critique, as the subtitle indicates, critique of political economy. However, it is still disputed today what actually is meant by critique. It has at least 4 dimensions, and it is remarkable that none of them should be construed as a negative judgment about the criticized society. All 4 are rather versions of an immanent critique. First, critique simply refers directly to the capitalist mode of production that Marx presents through a primarily systematically categorical development. Second, critique refers to the theoretical conception, or rather misconception, of this economy in bourgeois economic science, but it also refers to the understanding, or rather misunderstanding, of the economy in common sense and everyday life. The first 2 dimensions coincide with what Marx called a critique through presentation and vice versa. I quote a famous passage where he explains his idea of critique. The work I'm presently concerned with is a critique of economic categories, or, if you like, a critical exposé of the system of the bourgeois economy. It is at once an exposé and, by the same token, a critique of the system, end of quote. This refers to the essential critical feature in Hegel's dialectic mode of presentation, in which critique through presentation is to be taken in an immediate sense. Immediate means that each individual category critiques itself by immanently merging into another category, thus negating itself as isolated and at the same time achieving its determination by other categories. Hegel's famous term for this is sublation, aufheben, used in the 4-fold German sense: pick up, negate, maintain and conserve, and placed at a higher level. The fact that the individual categories require for the determination the immanent development leads to the necessity that Marx has to ultimately catch up with the whole political economy in its totality. Put simply, this means that to understand value and its valorization, we need to understand money. To understand money, we need to understand its different functions and their interconnection or entanglement, that is, ultimately, money's capitalist form. And to understand this capitalist form, we need to understand the valorization of both value and money by the forms of labor and capital, but also by the financial forms of money, such as credit and fictitious forms of capital like stocks or derivatives, etc. And the 4th dimension of critique finally points, of course, to the practical overcoming of capitalist society. Yet also this overcoming cannot succeed without an immanent necessity coming out, especially by capitalist contradictions and their social dynamic and historical development. All 4 dimensions of critique are contained in Marx's representation of the capitalist mode of production, and it's possible to read it along the logical categorical development of the functions and the economic circuits of money. Capital Volume 1 presents the main functions of money: measure of value, means of exchange and circulation, and capital form. Volume 2 then explains the economic reproduction circuits accomplished by money, and Volume 3 finally deals with the manifestation of valorization and prices, with money's finance forms such as credit money and fictitious capital, and with capitalist crisis. I don't want to go into detail here because it would overload my presentation, I only want to emphasize that the thoroughgoing feature and goal is to develop money, value, and capital as forms of social relations. I quote, "Money is not a thing, it is a social relation. Value is a social relation, and capital is not a thing, but rather a definite social production relation." I have to conclude the presentation of capital paradoxically with its famous beginning. Capital enters into the whole development with a famous and notorious analysis of the value form of the commodity. The analysis is really central for Marx's concept of money and for capital in total, and this is for mainly three reasons. Firstly, Marx exposes here his dialectical method of a logical categorical critique. Secondly, the analysis presents a kind of logical genesis of the pure and universal validity of money and hence of the origin of capitalist money. And thirdly, the analysis, precisely because of this logic, of its logical status, has a kind of privileged position preceding the actual presentation of the capitalist mode of production. And this corresponds to the central but also exposed and quasi-transcendental status of money in and for this capitalist production. However, this beginning of capital is for sure one of the most intensively and controversial discussed texts from Marx at all. Contested was, above all, how to read in a strong methodological sense the analysis, which is ultimately predecisive for reading capital in general. Two main readings confronted each other. The first was a rather traditional logical historical one, prepared and even propagated by none other than Engels, who interpreted the analysis as a kind of historical reconstruction of money from simple commodity production and commodity exchange. The second reading was a logical categorical one, developed in the course of the new Marx and Capital readings in the run-up of the social changes of the 1968 in various countries. It was a decisive insight of this logical categorical reading, developed especially by the German so-called New Marx reading, Neue Marx-Lektüre, that Marx analysis of the form X commodity A equals Y commodity B should not be interpreted as an exchange, whether in the sense of a historical reconstruction or that of a logical systematic genesis. Instead, the analysis logically shows the necessity of money by the failure of a direct pre-monetary exchange of commodities, proving the impossibility of such an exchange. The status of a commodity already presupposes money. Money, therefore, cannot be derived from direct commodity exchange or barter. The value form analysis has to rather be read as a critique of all pre-monetary value theories and as a monetary theory of value. In my view, this entanglement of money and value is the most important insight in the whole discussion around money in Marx. It was already discussed this morning, and I found out that it's also quite the opposite of what Fichte was thinking about money. Okay, with this main insight, I conclude the development throughout Marx's work. I would like to briefly discuss now the use of Marx's concept of money in critique and philosophy after Marx. I want to show this by only a couple of connections. The first connection is the connection between money and religion. Marx, throughout his work, repeatedly set money in relation to the Christian religion, faith, God, and Trinity, and critique after Marx tried to discover in which way money in capitalism had not only simply replaced, but continued and in a way even fulfilled the systematic and logical power of these religious forms. The suspicion was that there is some kind of hidden agreement between the negative self-reference of, on the one hand, monotheist religion and Christian God, and on the other hand, money's self-reference as capital. Important and well-known works in this direction are Max Weber's The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, and Walter Benjamin's fragment, Capitalism as Religion. The second connection we can call money and method. I said that Marx claims a kind of materialist turn of philosophy, and in particular of Hegelian dialectics. The turn claims above all to socialize with money, a mediation that is grasped in philosophy as subjectivity and spirit, reflection and reason, etc. However, the question arises what this socialization means. Is what Hegel developed as spirit in reality money, or is there only an analogy? And in what sense is the mediation in both Hegel and Marx dialectical, and in what sense is Marx dialectic a kind of materialist version or a turn of Hegel's? This leads to the next connection, the connection between money and the whole complex of necessary false consciousness, reification, fetishism, and ideology. This critique has a wide range, starting from reification and alienation. Here, George Lukács' essay collection, History and Class Consciousness, became a kind of initial spark, and it led to imagination and to ideological effects and mass ideology. Here, Western Marxism, critical theory, and scholars such as Althusser, Balibar, or Frederick Jameson were important. To distinguish from this complex is the next connection, namely the connection between money and science, and money form and thought form. Here, in contrast to a critique of epistemology, we have attempts to formulate a proper materialist theory of epistemology. Most influential was Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who based the unity of value form and thought form on the real abstraction of commodity exchange and money. The next two connections are the wide fields of money and culture, aesthetics and language, and of money, technique and power. Those connections are too complex to go into here. I rather want to conclude with the connection that I think is a supreme discipline, namely the connection between money and time. This connection is a kind of ultimate shorthand in which all the connections mentioned above or before come together. For this connection, the famous phrase, time is money, has to be taken in a literal sense. Nonetheless, there are two approaches. One is more sociological and makes an exoteric use of the connection, often based on empirical research, and the other is rather philosophical or esoteric and seeks an inner connection of money and time. Okay, with these connections, the most important areas where a use of Marx's concept of money was made may be covered, and I want to try a conclusion. We saw that the philosophical implications of Marx's concept of money are manifold. Money can be related to God and spirit, logic and dialectics, aesthetics, power, time, and so forth. Unclear in all cases, however, is not only how to methodologically set the relation, it is the entire status of money that is unclear. There's until today, across all disciplines, no universally accepted theory, philosophy, or critique of money at all. At best, there is agreement that money continues to pose a riddle to us. Apart from this mysteriousness, it is clear that Marx wanted to develop how money functions in capitalist mode of production, and this development is at once to be understood as an immanent and implicit critique of religious, philosophical, scientific, and deficiently socialist forms of society's self-understanding. Due to this comprehensive critique, Marx belongs to the series of great mortifications that Freud had compiled but failed to include Marx. First, the cosmological mortification that Copernicus gave to humanity, that the Earth is not the center of the world, but revolves around the sun. Second, Darwin's biological mortification, for which humanity is not God's creator, which humanity is not God's creature, but descent from the ape. And third, finally, the psychoanalytic mortification that Freud himself brought to bear, that the ego is not master in its own house, but has an unconscious and obeys a superego. Marx inflicts on humanity the mortification of treating value, although in value their very own social relations are revealed, like a mere economic quantity, and reflects and must reflect value as a quasi-natural being and a property of things in themselves. Even more, it is not only the individual subject, but also money as a quasi-subject itself that must realize and mediate, like in an unconscious as objective valid reflection, our social relations and present them as pure quantitative values. I quote and conclude, all the illusions of the monetary system are due to the fact that money is not regarded as something representing a social relation of production, but as a natural thing endowed with certain properties. Oh, okay, I got to go from left to right from my perspective.
I have a question about the Neue Marx. As I understood Marx, the theory of values is supposed to have an explanatory role in explaining why money prices are what they are, right? But if I understood you correctly, on the new reading, if money prices and the value theory are sort of like, if the value theory presupposes money prices in some sense, then the value theory can't play that explanatory role anymore, right? So what is it doing then?
I think that it's so there, as you might know, there's an endless discussion about money's. I always say money instead of Marx. Marx theory of value, and also about his money theory. But I think the most important insight was that you cannot derive money from value, and especially not from an objective labor theory or production process. But this was a basic assumption in classical Marxism. They always thought, like Fichte, first comes the material production process, and money is only representing it. So in a way, it was the same as not only Fichte, but all the mainstream or bourgeois economics say that money is a neutral means, and it's only representing, barter, or in the case of Smith and Ricardo, it presents in a way labor. And why I think this Neue Marx Lektüre, this new Marx reading in Germany is so important is because it was making it the other way around. They say there's no way to derive money from value as if it is logically or chronological prior. You have to start in a way on a logical level with money, and money can then explain why it is possible to make this capitalist mode of production, or in general, why is it possible that you have independent producers, why you have something like an open market where you can exchange the products that people have produced. And this was important for the discussion in the Marxist, all Marxist area, because it was in a way totally destabilizing the classical assumption of classical Marxism, who made it always in a way the other way around, and based not only the question of money on an objective labor theory of value, but also the whole political concept, the socialist state, the socialist politics, class struggle, epistemological stuff. Everything was, as we know in classical Marxism, based as if labor is something prior to money, and money is something which comes after and has only an in a way, not only a derived status, but an artificial or a neutral status at best.
I feel that is because in the last session I posed a question and time was up. So if someone wants to go before me, then yeah, I agree. I think the at this point in the Neue Marx-Lektüre, if you look at Isaac Rubin or Franz Petri, they make the same. Or they already see this point that
they were tackling the problem, but they have not introduced money in the same way as a new Marx reading did. They were focusing on the form and the value form. Yeah. They were the first one starting this kind of form analytic reading.
Okay. Yeah. So, but the question that I had was, I mean, there's a lot in the talk. So maybe this is just a detail. But you, I think at some point you said that you talked about the commodity fetishism, that it's primarily a critique of epistemology, and I think at some point it's that, but I'm pretty sure that there's a couple of quotes where the peer doesn't, the Erscheinen doesn't read as it seems to be, but at least there's one quote where he says the producers see their productive relations as what they are, namely as social relations between objects and objective relations between persons. And so I feel like sort of saying that this is an epistemological critique, doesn't tell the whole story. So it couldn't, the commodity fetishism couldn't be overcome by sort of gaining more insights. If we all that's how it works.
Exactly.
Okay, so then maybe sort of.
But this is what I mean by epistemological status. It's not only a critique saying, people don't understand the economy, or there's some kind of inversion or perversion inside the commodity, so it's necessary to have this kind of conception or misconception. I think it has an interesting status, and I think it's important to emphasize that fetishism does not mean what, for example, Benjamin. It was very fruitful, but Benjamin thought fetishism is just what the use value is proposing or telling us, and so he built a whole strain of a critique or the use of fetishism, or he had also other words for it, but it was totally misleading. Also, Adorno in critical theory took fetishism just like an inversion or perversion or something which is only misleading. But I think, and also in Marx, there's ambivalences. So fetishism has these saying something is so the wrong side, the wrong side around, but we have to. I say it in different words. I think the critical insight is that Marx says we have to reflect social relations as if it is a property of a thing. And this is fetish in one sentence, his fetish theory, to say we have to think social relations as a value of this model.
In markets, we do this, or we do this. We have to.
But we do this also in natural science. We also know that also natural science has to treat property of objects as if it is a property of the object in itself. But also they know that these properties are due to the relations in nature. But it's a mode of thinking which is necessary and which has a different status, in my view, than just to call it reification and say, this is reification if we think so social relations as property of things. This is reification. And I think this is a step forward from Marx to overcome these, so in these early writings, this idea of objectivation, alienation, reification, and fetishism is different. And so this is why I make such an emphasis on saying that it has an epistemological status. But this is so, of course, it's open to interpretations, and a lot of people have totally different concepts of it. It's a long debate on fetishism, and very good, so books on fetishism in general, not only in Marx, but so.
No, of course, yeah.
So, if I heard you correctly, commodities and capitalism, according to Marx, can only exist once capitalist money exists, because the value form that is either expressed or embodied or something by capitalist money is a precondition for commodities to be what they are. Is that
On the logical level.
on the logical level?
Logical level. If you
Okay.
can speak, a thing has a status of a commodity only if there's a general equivalent, a measure of value, a means of exchange.
Okay, so then as a methodological point at the beginning of Capital, why doesn't Marx go in that order? Why does he start with the commodity and then get the money?
Super good question. It's really complicated why he has chosen. In the end, I think the best way to read Capital is a dialectical way that it recaptures the preconditions. And he starts with the dual character of labor and commodity and say, to understand why it has a dual character, I have to make this analysis. The analysis shows the necessity of money. So the dual character of labor and of capital, two fundamental categories for the political economy, is due to that they presupposes already money. So he develops in the value form analysis only money as a precondition of this dual character, and money has a status of a pure, a pure validity and a measure of value. Then he goes and says, okay, to realize this dual character, we have to look at the exchange and circulation process. And then he goes on and says, to understand the circulation and exchange process, we have to understand that it's produced and that it's only the surface of the society. So we have to look at the conditions of the production of commodities. And then he says, so there's two elements, labor and capital, which are producing the commodities. So the value of the commodities does not come out of exchange or interest or the relations of the commodities. The value and the magnitudes of value come out of the productive power of the valorization of labor power by capital. And so he goes in a way, it is the same dialectical progress as in phenomenology of spirit and in maybe also in the science of logic. This is what my book is a little bit about. But there's much discussion why he does not make clear. So what I do now is start with labor and commodity. What I really want to show is that labor is capitalist labor, that value and commodity and all the categories are capitalist determined. And I have to go through the whole process to recapture these capitalist preconditions. And it's totally wrong to read it as a historical development. This is what a little bit, so Engels thought, the value moment, so he looks back in history and so that is a barter theory of money. But it was misleading. Marx had 4 different versions to develop money in 4 different books. And the final and definite one is Capital, but also Capital has different versions because there's an original capital, then there's a second and a fourth version, which are quite different. He never finished volume 2 and 3, and he has 4 versions of the volume form analysis, and 3 versions are in Capital. So the original version, the first edition, had a value form analysis in the beginning, then in the appendix, and then in the later editions, he tried to reformulate, and they are quite different. So you see that he himself was struggling with so how to bring together money and value and commodity and labor. Yeah, you are the only one having a question.
How would I know that? Can Marx put daylight between capitalism and monetization? Could you have a pervasively monetized society for Marx that's not also a capitalist society?
There were money all over the history of mankind. There were always forms of money, but this is not what Marx is saying. So when he looks at the origin of money, at the historical origin of money, so the value form analysis in Capital is only speaking about money and capitalism. It's not a historical reconstruction of money, but he has some passages where he says, money came into the world when tribes are meeting each other and have some kind of surplus product and are exchanging, which is an old school, so Smithian or some mainstream economic assumption, which is, I think it's outdated and it's totally wrong. But I think there always has been forms of money, but these forms of money, as I said so earlier this morning, are totally different from capitalist money. So there's also people who say, or it's obvious that also before coins, there has been forms of money. So 5,000 years in David Graeber means already since 5,000 years we have forms of money, because David Graeber says, so the first types of just writing down something is a form of money. And also all these gift and sacrifice communities, these are also forms of money, which are relating and mediating totally different social relations. And the same goes is for the coin, but the coin is mediating so totally different social mediations. And so capitalist money is capitalist money because our social relations are totally different from ancient Greece, like ancient Greece is different from gift relations between tribes or whatsoever. So this is why I think it's so important that Marx put so much emphasis to say value, capital, and money are social relations. So to understand money just means to go through the whole capitalist social relation and explain why we go to work, what is the means of production, why the means of production are produced, how can we increase the productivity by using natural science and stuff.
I understand you to be identifying what's distinctive about capitalist money is that it's somehow pervasively, the quantification of social relations. But then I have a difficult time imagining different monetary relations that wouldn't also be quantified. So what would money be if it wasn't quantified?
It's a new form of quantification, first of all. Quantification in capitalism is totally different from quantification in ancient Greece. Because to say I give you, I don't know, $5 for a goat is something, it's just quantifying a goat. While in capitalism, money is quantifying the social relations to produce this goat. So going to work, being having commodified labor on the one hand, commodified means of production, which is true only for capitalism. But particular for capitalism is that quantification became reflexive by the self-reference of money as capital. And this money has never done this before. On the contrary, all societies try to hinder that money becomes this kind of self-reference. And where they came interest right from the beginning in ancient Greece and in Christian writings, they always say this is something wrong. It's bad. How can money create more money? This is against God because all the time belongs to God. And if in time money becomes more, there must be something irregular, something against God or something against your neighbor or whatever. And so this possibility to say that there's a self-reference of money as capital, making from a certain sum more money, is justified because there's some productivity and some kind of exploitation during this process, which is not against someone, but it's only so using productivity, and so it's not a crime against time or God, but it's something which comes out of this self-reference of money. It's only in capitalism.
It helps. Thank you.
Just maybe a quick question. So it's an interesting question. Is do you need a conceptual change in quantification to allow money to have this pervasive reach, or is it the other way around? Because there's all this really interesting research about the origins of probability theory, risk theory, which then allows the idea that we can calculate social risks, development of insurance, and that's 17th and 18th century. Yeah. So I'm just curious your own thinking, what the relationship is between the history of quantification, which I agree with you, there is a kind of fundamental transformation, which then also connects to these larger debates about the increased mathematization of nature.
Exactly.
Is that the precondition, both historical and logical?
I think there's no causality. It comes all together and at once. You can't say, there's first modern natural science and then these ideas jump over to economy. Because there's a radical change and a new conception of quantification everywhere. The state has a new dimension, treating the citizens as all equal and homogeneous with all the same rights. The same goes for law. Natural science is a totally different quantification because they quantify nature in a totally different way as ancient Greece has done it. In economy, it's also a totally different kind of quantification as was in previous time. But I can't say this was first and then everything derives from it. I think it's a kind of, as in general, you can't, this is why I think so dialectics pop up. So Hegel tried to deal with this quandary or dilemma. When you don't have a causality in social relations, you need some kind of, Heidegger calls it Gleichursprünglichkeit, so and originate at once.
Equiprimority.
Equiprimority, Althusser says it's a structural causality. And I think so this is important methodological to tackle money, because otherwise you have these monocausal or
That's true, but I guess it would be important to tease it out a bit with more
I
nuance.
was always struggling how
Otherwise,
to,
the claim of materialist turn.
Yeah.
I mean,
I always made analogies. I said, so what Hegel says about spirit is what Marx says about money, is what modern natural science says about the self-organization of matter, is what so political opinion says about the free individual, and there are analogies. But I can't say which was what was the chicken and what was the egg.